The text buzzed in as I adjusted my tie. Christopher, don't go home tonight. At first, I thought my brother was warning me about some family crisis, or worse, that my wife had swapped her lasagna recipe for the gluten-free version. That alone would qualify as betrayal. But his tone felt heavier, sharper, like it wasn't about pasta at all. He sent me one text, don't go home tonight. Pause. So naturally, I ignored it and did the exact opposite, because in my head, I wasn't just going home. I was returning to my empire, this self-proclaimed empire. Christopher Graham liked to imagine himself as far more than an ordinary landlord. In his mind, he was a builder of kingdoms, a ruler whose name echoed along city skylines. That was the story he told himself anyway. The reality was less awe-inspiring. His so-called empire was a modest portfolio of rentals and a handful of storefronts. But where others saw cracked sidewalks and half-empty strip plazas, Christopher saw fortresses, ramparts, and vital territories under his command. Scale meant little to him. Perception meant everything. He carried himself with that conviction daily. Each morning, before walking out the door, he delivered a whispered speech to his bathroom mirror, quiet declarations about vigilance and loyalty, before giving his own reflection a solemn nod, as if he had just knighted himself for battle. On the drive to work, the ordinary hum of the news became his inspiration for allegories about rival clans and shifting borders. Another construction company winning a contract wasn't competition, it was an invasion. A tenant disputing rent wasn't a complaint, it was rebellion. This imaginative lens elevated even the most pedestrian errands. Once, while picking up office supplies, he leaned against a shopping cart in Office Depot and muttered with complete seriousness, "The kingdom will not fall while I draw breath." Of course, the epic soundtrack in his mind rarely matched his surroundings. His bastions were simply low-rise buildings lugging along under overdue maintenance. The so-called jewel of his holdings was a retail strip with more vacancies than profits. Yet he talked about these properties as though they were the bedrock of civilization. Tenants heard weary reminders to pay rent. When Christopher retold the same exchanges over dinner, they became accounts of strategic victories. A call about a broken pipe upgraded in his mind to the siege of the northern wall. A request for discounted rent became treachery brewing among the ranks. Somehow, he always emerged from these dramatized tales as the triumphant general holding his ground. Those around him developed their own ways of coping. His wife, Ashley, often sighed out loud when he announced that chauffeuring their daughter to soccer practice was a royal decree fulfilled. His teenage son rolled his eyes with professional precision at words like succession or heir. Martin, his younger brother, poked fun at him by occasionally addressing him as Your Majesty, especially at family gatherings. And though Martin liked to laugh at the exaggerations, he also knew that beneath Christopher's flair for melodrama was genuine consistency. To Christopher, loyalty wasn't just a theme, it was the law. And while his bluster made for easy jokes, the people closest to him recognized the seriousness underneath. He was ruthless at work and, allegedly, devoted at home. Despite how transparent his theatrics might appear to others, Christopher never considered his mental habits foolish. He believed his way of viewing the world spoke to a higher truth, that vigilance mattered in small things as much as in large ones. He talked about defending the walls while walking the perimeter of his backyard fence. Recycling trips became rituals of civic stewardship. On paper, his actions were ordinary. In his head, they maintained order against chaos. That constant framing didn't just fill his days with drama, it hardened him against ever dismissing small disruptions as unimportant. Two examples illustrated this better than anything. When someone left a one-star online review complaining about noisy pipes, Christopher didn't see plumbing maintenance. He saw an insurrection spreading by rumor, a propaganda attack meant to weaken the realm's confidence. Then, when his wife suggested the reviewer probably just wanted hot water, Christopher stood firm that kingdoms collapse when leaders fail to confront whispers. And not long after, when asked to decide between ordering pizza or Chinese takeout, he called it negotiating new alliances with outside tribes. His family laughed, rolled their eyes, and kept eating, but he wasn't joking. These reframings, while absurd to an outsider, made up the fabric of his daily being. His commitment to the fantasy produced a strange kind of sincerity. Whenever tenants paid on time, or whenever his wife handled dinner without complaint, he took those things as proof of fidelity to the realm. Every small nod of cooperation became evidence that his fortress stood strong. Missing rent payments weren't just financial setbacks, they were betrayals. Gentle teasing from Ashley wasn't humor, but desecration. Living inside this structure of meaning left him wide open to disappointment, but also deeply invested in the sanctity of his imagined dominion. And this was the foundation for the tension that followed. Because Christopher, for all the modest substance of his holdings, already viewed himself as a patriarch, defending sacred walls against unending threats. He saw enemies in the smallest corners and allies in the most banal favors. He could turn water damage into aristocratic sabotage and replace overdue rent with tales of treason. It was all part of a stage he kept building in his head, layering speech over mundane actions until everything carried the weight of history, which is why his brother's brief and cryptic message struck harder than it should have. When Martin told him not to go home, the words landed not as friendly caution, but as something seismic, a storm breaking over his domain. Christopher's empire may have been measured in square footage rather than city blocks, but in his imagination, no warning was ever trivial. If the smallest billing issue could be recast into a siege, then a text from his own brother was nothing less than an omen. That certainty followed him into every setting. Even boarding a plane, he carried himself as though he were being ferried to a summit rather than a seating area. It didn't matter if he was dragging a standard carry-on or sitting in a cramped seat among strangers. In his head, he was entering with gravitas, presiding over a council. And to anyone watching closely, it was clear his imagination wasn't taking a break, even at 30,000 feet. Airplane Philosophy Hour. Christopher Graham sat tall in first class, convinced the cabin had been arranged to honor his presence. Travel, for him, was never a simple crossing from one point to another. It was a stage, each mile aloft a chance to rehearse his philosophy. He rested a firm hand on the armrest and peered across the aisle at a passenger asleep beneath a blanket. In his mind, he narrated silently, even at altitude, leaders cannot waver. It wasn't muttered under his breath, this time, but his posture said everything. The passenger merely turned away, while the flight attendant swept by without a second glance, pointedly ignoring him. The selective silence didn't wound his ego. He reinterpreted it into proof that rulers often endured the dismissal of those too timid to grasp their message. At cruising altitude, his mind itched for a symbol to cement his self-appointed role. He placed a laptop on his tray table and set his expression into practiced seriousness. Where others saw a man working on business strategy, he knew the truth. The spreadsheet-like grid before him was a half-finished Sudoku puzzle. Most of it was already wrong, but that hardly mattered. He leaned back after entering a number, satisfied, as if he had just signed an international treaty. To him, misreading boxes wasn't a failure. It was strategy. Evidence of command written in neat, printed numerals. The game carried weight because he gave it weight, another document in the archive of his imagined dominion. Hours passed, the usual hum of the cabin a steady rhythm against his thoughts. Passengers sat quiet, earphones hugged skulls, screens glowed with films, but Christopher's world remained loud, thick with metaphors no one else could hear. In the safety card tucked into the seat pocket, he found scripture. He marked circles around the oxygen mask diagram and underlined the words secure before assisting others. In his retelling, this wasn't about air pressure, it was doctrine, a survival principle for dynasties. One row behind him, a man gave a faint throat, clearing that hinted at irritation. Christopher smirked and interpreted it as resistance. Resistance always proved the truth was sharp enough to sting. But mid-philosophy, a small interruption arrived with the strength of thunder. His phone buzzed against the tray table. The sound was faint, but to him it was monumental, an omen breaking through the cabin's lull. He reached for it with ritualistic care, as though retrieving a sacred decree. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he savored the weight of not yet knowing, imagining whole storylines behind the glow of a locked screen. Would it announce betrayal at home? Would it confirm that his household fortress, so carefully tended, now carried cracks in its walls? Or was it something even more staggering? A warning carried through signals that had somehow pierced the clouds, only to reach him. The surrounding passengers barely noticed. To them, it was no more than a man distracted from his puzzle. But inside Christopher's mind, the tension swelled larger than the cabin itself. He turned the screen up slightly, exhaling through his nose with slow control. In that moment of pause, he believed himself suspended between eras, the world before the message and the world after. Finally, with one deliberate tap, he revealed the text. The digital font was unceremonious, almost banal. Just one line. From Martin. It said only, "Don't go home tonight." His throat tightened as imagination leapt the schemes and fractures. To everyone else in row 2 of this flight, the light blinked above with the signal to fasten belts for descent. But for Christopher, the air had thickened. The walls of his domain seemed closer in his mind, and Martin's warning was already rewriting the path ahead. The aircraft angled downward, toward the city, and his anticipation coiled itself into expectation of a homecoming that could no longer be taken for granted. What he chose to believe about that line, the gravity, the conspiracies, the fracture of loyalty, was something he carried with him as the wheels prepared to meet the ground. The warning call. Christopher stepped off the plane and moved through the terminal with the kind of posture he reserved for moments he believed mattered. To him, this wasn't a crowded airport at all, but a ceremonial return. Automatic doors became gates, escalators a slow-moving parade. Of course, the reality was far less flattering. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A janitor pushed a mop bucket across his path, and a child somewhere behind him screamed for candy. None of it intruded on his self-mythology. He still imagined trumpets. He still carried his suitcase like it contained the fate of a realm. At baggage claim, he planted his stance as though saluting the carousel. Other travelers scanned the rotating belt for their luggage. Christopher pretended he was reclaiming plunder after a hard-fought campaign. When his bag finally appeared, wobbling on one tired wheel and scuffed around the edges, he seized it with deliberate force. He whispered to himself, "The treasure's return," ignoring a mother wrestling a stroller nearby who stopped briefly to stare at him. The glow of his phone interrupted everything. Martin's name flashed on the screen, followed by a message stripped of personality and punctuation. "Don't go home tonight." 4 words. Stark. Flat. Complete. Christopher froze with his hand still on the suitcase handle as people flowed around him. He read it once. Twice. Each time slower, heavier. In his head, it carried the weight of prophecy. Of all days, why tonight? His mind ignited. The first suspicion landed not on violence or crime, but on something closer, something intimate. Ashley's lasagna. For 15 years, it had been the anchor of every homecoming. Suppose, he thought, the unthinkable had occurred. She'd given into a fad and swapped the noodles for zucchini slices or quinoa. What if Martin had heard first and was saving Christopher the trauma, walking blindly into a meal-shaped betrayal? He fired off a reply. "Has the recipe changed?" Silence. His brother didn't respond. The carousel creaked and emptied, luggage disappearing into the hands of strangers, but Christopher stayed unmoving. His pulse ticked upward with each second of no reply. Then, another buzz. This time, only 2 words, very serious. The tone crushed his earlier theory. His chest tightened. Not lasagna, then something worse. He scanned the terminal like a man under threat, eyes flicking over strangers who could hide conspiracies behind casual gestures. Thoughts bloomed in exaggerated color, Ashley aligning herself with Andre Travis, his rival developer. The children lured into complacency. Even the dog, the German shepherd he'd always considered suspiciously dignified, perhaps slipping into command, seated on the family couch with a crown of construction paper. The vision hit with such clarity that he briefly imagined it playing out right at that moment. Ashley leaning toward their son, whispering strategy. Andre in the dining room drafting maps. The dog barking commands that everyone followed. Christopher set his jaw, refusing to flinch in public, but his head flooded with imagery too absurd to control. By the time he stepped onto the escalator, the words, "Don't go home tonight," had stretched into a monument of meaning. He constructed entire plots around them. What if Ashley had thrown open secret alliances with tenants? What if Andre coached her by phone, bribing loyalty with promises of better management? Each step downward compounded the theater inside his head. He couldn't take it any longer. With his free hand shaking slightly, Christopher pressed Martin's name on the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. Martin answered instantly. His voice was low, too low, and flat. "Don't return home," came the repeat. No humor, no sarcasm. Martin, the brother who never took a moment seriously, now armed his words with weight. Christopher's breathing slowed. "Is Ashley compromised?" he asked, whispering as if nearby. "Travelers might overhear state secrets." There was no immediate answer on the other end. Just an exhale, followed by silence. To Christopher, that silence was confirmation of his darkest theories. In those 5 seconds, he built futures, neighbors' toddlers pressed into service as spies, blueprints scattered across their dining table, candlelight plotting sessions unfolding with grim seriousness. He saw betrayal already scripted. Finally, Martin's voice returned. "Trust me, just don't go. No expansion, no elaboration, no evidence. Just resolve." Christopher swallowed against the dryness in his throat, staring out past the sliding doors toward the city's evening lights. His mind carved those 5 words into sentences centuries long. But beneath the paranoia, something colder settled in. Martin's tone hadn't cracked. That meant one thing to him. Whatever was happening, it was beyond the scope of dinner squabbles or recipe swaps. He tightened his grip on the handle of his bag and stepped through those automatic doors without hesitation. People scattered toward taxis and family pickups, but Christopher walked with a fixed decision. For once, he would not return home. He would go directly to Martin. The thought carried him forward, night air pressing sharp against his face. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary man leaving the terminal after a flight. To Christopher, it felt like crossing from safety into the opening scene of Infiltration. I went to Martin, not home. Brotherly espionage. Christopher arrived at Martin's house just after dusk, the edges of daylight fading into shadow as he pulled into the driveway. Whatever theories he'd spun in his head on the way over collapsed the moment the front door swung open. Martin stood there, not in jeans or a hoodie, but in black cargo pants and a plain t-shirt completed by a headset microphone that wasn't actually wired to anything. His expression carried none of its usual mischief. "Finally," he muttered, tugging Christopher inside before a greeting could form. The living room had been converted into something between a college film project and a low-rent spy drama. A tangle of wires sprawled across the carpet, feeding into laptops perched on end tables that looked dangerously near collapse. A corkboard dominated the wall, plastered with photographs and sketches, pens and string crisscrossing like a parody of an FBI crime map. On the coffee table sat night vision goggles beside a jar grandly labeled emergency rations, which, upon inspection, turned out to be nothing more than trail mix. Christopher froze, taking it in. His first instinct was disbelief, followed by irritation at how elaborate the setup looked. His brother, who still borrowed passwords from relatives to dodge subscription fees, had apparently been living inside a private intelligence agency constructed out of printed inkjet photos and duct tape. He leaned closer to the corkboard. One oversized folder sat upright near the top, its spine scrawled with a title in thick marker, Operation Leftovers. He plucked it free and held it up. "That's the code name? Leftovers?" His voice almost cracked with disbelief. Martin quickly hushed him, eyes flicking toward a cheap motion sensor taped to the ceiling. Before Christopher could sit, Martin launched into explanation. His voice was sharper than usual, and that alone unsettled him. "I've been monitoring the house for months," he said. "Unusual patterns. Someone's been leaking information, subtle but consistent. Communication that doesn't fit the schedule." His hands moved toward the laptop in a way that made Christopher's chest tighten. Something about the seriousness in his tone so at odds with the ridiculous decor of this so-called headquarters, struck him as heavier than the theatrics implied. Christopher pointed to one of the blown-up photographs on the wall, his wife, Ashley, adjusting a bookshelf. "That's cleaning," he said flatly. "That's not betrayal." Martin narrowed his eyes and folded his arms. "That's obscuring documents, covering tracks, a tactic as old as espionage itself." He snapped his fingers and pivoted to another photo of Brandon hunched in front of a keyboard. "And this, your son operates an entire account on TikTok where he reenacts her speeches, adds dramatic background music. If that's not a breach of house security, what is?" The information caught Christopher off guard. For a moment, amusement and a flick of pride slipped through. His monologues apparently had made their way online. Still, the idea of them circulating unsettled him. "That's theater," he muttered, "not treason." Martin ignored the objection, pacing the room with the restless energy of a detective about to submit evidence to court. Christopher steadied his tone, demanding precision. "You dragged me away from my own home. You forced me into this lab experiment of paranoia. Tell me plainly, what is the danger?" The question seemed to give Martin the permission he'd been waiting for. He sat down, rolled his chair forward, and pressed a remote. A monitor flickered to life, filling the dim room with unsteady light. At first, nothing on the grainy footage seemed remarkable. Christopher leaned in, and for a brief second he recoiled. Ashley was there, walking across their backyard toward the garage. The way she glanced over her shoulder, lit only by the faint spill of a porch lamp, sent a chill prickling down his arm. On the screen, she bent down, lifted something from inside the garage, then carried it briskly away in a cardboard box. To Christopher, it looked like storage, the kind of errand she'd performed countless times. But his body told a different story. Muscles too tight, lungs slower than a heartbeat earlier. Martin's voice cut through that hesitation. "That's not routine. That's a handoff." He jabbed his finger at the frozen frame. Christopher opened his mouth to argue, but snapped it shut fast. He shook his head, as though the act of denial alone might banish what he had just felt inside. "It's nothing," he whispered, quieter now. Martin already pulled another file onto the screen. Charts and notes occupied the corkboard in neon highlighter, filled with timestamps, arrows, and smudged handwriting. Christopher stepped closer, unsettled by what he saw. Grocery visits, broken into military-style shifts. A diagram labeled student movements, mapping his daughter Rachel's school drop-offs as though they were coded missions. Examinations circled in red. Possible practice exercise. He stared at the mess and half smiled in frustration. "Martin, you're charting trips to the supermarket like troop deployments." His brother slapped the edge of the board. "Exactly." The humor of the scene, so obvious on its surface, weighed awkwardly against the force of Martin's certainty. Christopher massaged his temples while Martin rambled about router security, viral trends, and alleged signals hidden in renovation budgets. Every tangent pulled him further from clarity, but the intensity of Martin's conviction made his skin prickle. He couldn't shake the image of Ashley on that monitor, carrying a box that suddenly felt ominous in hindsight. Then Christopher slumped into a chair, exhausted. "Is this all theater, Martin? Just you drowning in boredom? Or is there a truth inside it?" His brother leaned back, folding his arms slowly, letting silence stretch. Finally, in a voice so stable it drained the room of all pretense, he said, "You don't just have unfaithful tenants, Christopher. If you have unfaithful blood." The hum of a cluttered mini-fridge was the only sound that followed. Empty cans stacked against the wall glinted faintly in the glow of the monitor. Christopher pressed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, eyes drawn back toward the corkboard covered in absurd details. Among the scattered nonsense, though, sat fragments that refused to dissolve, timelines, recordings, and then his wife's image caught mid-stride with a box she hadn't explained. His pulse thumped unevenly. He tried to laugh, aiming for dismissal, but it came out raspy, hollow. Martin's face didn't soften, not even a twitch betraying amusement. For once, his brother looked exactly like someone who believed every mark on every page mattered. That truth hit harder than the piles of folders or the equipment spread across the living room. Christopher realized he was breathing faster than before. Parody or not, Martin's conviction had painted a corner around him, trapping him in its certainty. He sat back against the chair and exhaled, saying little, because admitting aloud that any part of this operation felt serious would mean surrender. Yet the images lingered. Ashley's glance, the box. Every shrug disguised as routine now replayed with new weight. Martin turned back to the laptop, his finger hovering over the next file with the slow drama of a man sure he was about to change the course of the night. The glow of the monitor flickered again, spilling across charts and wires. Christopher sat upright despite himself, shoulders stiff, braced for whatever proof his brother intended to unveil. The room quieted further, tension saturating the gap between them. For the first time since arriving, Christopher's eyes locked fully on the screen, uneasy but unwilling to look away. This wasn't about the clutter or the trail mix anymore. Martin was about to show him something. Something he claimed would leave no room for doubt. The shocking evidence? Kind of. Martin dimmed the lights, his face lit by the cool glow of the monitor. He clicked through files with grim purpose, while Christopher sat at the edge of an armchair, stiff-backed and tense. The grainy footage came first. A side camera view revealed Ashley slipping quietly into Christopher's office. She looked around quickly, and to Christopher it felt staged, furtive. He leaned forward, heart pounding. This was it. Proof. She opened the cabinet, shuffled through files, dropped her head into her hands, and then began sorting the mess into neat stacks. Papers aligned, stray pens capped, contracts squared as if the desk were finally hers to command. Christopher muttered under his breath. That's not conspiracy, that's unpaid office labor. He wanted the words to dismiss the tension creeping up his spine, but they landed hollow in the quiet. Martin's eyes didn't leave the screen. Or it's misdirection, he said flatly. Camouflage. A spy cleans to erase traces as much as to hide her own. Ashley pulled a Sudoku page free from the folders and made a face before stuffing it back. Christopher bristled. She mocks the strategy in those grids. She doesn't grasp the tactical balance of an advanced puzzle. Martin ignored him, skipping the video forward with a flick. The scene shifted. Ashley entered again, only this time she wasn't alone. The camera angle widened, and Christopher froze as another figure slid into view. Man lowered himself into his chair, crossing one leg into place with unsettling comfort. Ashley perched on the corner of the desk beside him. Martin leaned closer. There, now you see it. Christopher whispered the thought like a secret, "That's my chair." He raised his hand, pointing stiffly. Look at him, reclining, casual elbows, as though imported leather is owed to him. He treats my throne as if it were a waiting room seat. The name hit him a moment later, pulled from memory, Andre Travis. A rival, smiling faintly, resting back as if he belonged. The video then cut to Ashley entering the office with a man Christopher didn't recognize, Andre Travis, and the two of them moved like collaborators, not guests. Martin's description burned in his ears. Ashley laughed lightly at something Andre muttered. Her head tilted close to him, not with formality, but with ease. Christopher's jaw clenched. She sits casually on the battlefield of negotiation, as though we draft grocery lists there. As though contracts are not sacred. She lets him occupy the seat of authority, and she, Christopher, faltered, his voice breaking into mutters. The laugh, the small, offhand sound, spooled into his head larger than the room itself. Martin boosted the audio. The crackling sound sharpened, forming words. Ashley's voice spoke, dismissive, almost mocking. He thinks he's untouchable, but he tells me everything. Christopher flinched, not only for the sharpness of the words, but for the phrasing itself. She could have said, strategically transparent, he hissed. Instead, she belittles trust into carelessness. Martin's hands flew up. Stop dissecting adjectives. Hear the meaning. She leaks her confidence into Travis's hands. Christopher's eyes narrowed at the monitor. And she uncapped my pants. You notice that? Stationary sabotage. Martin exhaled sharply, wanting to argue, but pressing the video forward instead. The next clip made Christopher hold his breath. Brandon. His son hunched at the office computer, dragging files into another folder. At first, Christopher leaned in, searching for context. Then Martin's finger jabbed at the screen. That's it. He's moving classified material. Stolen files. Brandon's fumbling hands hesitated over the mouse, dragging and renaming. Deathly serious to Martin. Careless to Christopher. Christopher squinted. Those aren't financial records. Those are my Sudoku drafts. On the monitor, Brandon retyped file after file as homework essay. Academic dishonor is one thing, Christopher muttered, but hijacking puzzles to sell as his schoolwork? It is treason, yes, but against the teacher, not against my dominion. Martin pressed his lips thin. Think broader. He's chosen Andre's camp. Obedience redirected. The footage cut again. Rachel now, clutching her phone close to her, lips pressed in concentration. Martin leaned close, whispering like he was narrating Espionage. She's live, recording your calls, feeding him your schedules by voice. Christopher tilted his head at the grainy clip. Rachel hit record, then absent-mindedly hummed into the mic while sketching flowers on her homework. The phone's red circle blinked longer than needed. She left it recording as she hummed out of tune. Christopher exhaled, half groan, half irritation. She's not an operative. She's preserving off-key tune fragments. I'd sooner call it sabotage to music than betrayal of me. But even as he dismissed, the image of her crouching in his office, holding her phone like vital hardware, ate at him. Brandon, fumbling with files. Rachel, pocketing audio logs. Ashley, leaning too near another man. Martin let the clips run, his voice strict. Do not resist this truth. Andre recruits them all. Every asset compromised. Christopher sat with arms folded, lips pressed thin. His rationale fought for footing. Sudoku was misfiled, not stolen. Humming was noise, not intelligence. Yet, between those justifications slipped the undeniable, the way Ashley laughed in Andre's presence. The way Andre leaned back in his seat, Christopher's seat, as though the chair were already his. Andre filled the camera frame now, arms crossed. He leaned forward, his grin routed straight toward the hidden lens. The children are willing to help us take him down, his voice said, carried through the static. The tone, confident yet theatrical, lodged in Christopher's skull. A boast, a certainty, perhaps even rehearsed. His denial tumbled, collapsing under the image of Brandon's clumsy clicks, Rachel's blinking phone, Ashley's posture beside Andre. Well, Martin demanded, eyes sharp. Christopher said nothing for a long time. He sank back slowly into the armchair, lips pressed thin, breathing through his nose as though anchoring himself against the room's spin. He did not argue about puzzles. He did not rant about lumbar support. His silence betrayed more than comment could. His hands shook slightly, hidden in the half-dark, the tremor running from his fists into the armrests. His foundation, a wife, children. His private office now flickered like fragile set pieces. The chair, the laughter, the uncapped pens, trivialities in the face of the larger betrayal. Yet those trivialities rooted themselves painfully. They mocked him. They trivialized him. His brother leaned toward the glow of the screen, but Christopher kept his eyes fixed on the image of Andre in his office, seated where he should never belong. And in his silence, one thought turned, sharper than all the rest. Andre Travis. Villain profile, Andre Travis. Martin's file on him was thick, but Christopher already saw Andre Travis as an enemy before a single page turned. To him, Andre wasn't simply another developer from Seattle. He was the intruder who had stepped across invisible borders into Chicago. And worse, the man who now appeared in footage beside Ashley. That combination made him larger than life in Christopher's head, a villain molded out of rivalry and betrayal. The first pages of Martin's dossier held a collection of photographs, corporate headshots that looked as if they'd been scraped from LinkedIn. Andre appeared in the same navy suit every time, ties gleaming a shade too glossy under studio lights. His smile never wavered, teeth fixed in a wide display that seemed rehearsed more than natural. Beneath some of the images were self-written captions: connector, visionary, disruptor. Christopher recoiled as though the words themselves emitted poison. "That's infiltration vocabulary," he said through clenched teeth. "He dismantles loyalty under the mask of innovation." Martin shrugged without looking up. "It's LinkedIn fluff. Everyone tries too hard there." To Christopher, the threadbare phrases weren't attempts at branding. They were signals of concealed hostility. If Andre called himself a disruptor online, in Christopher's imagination, he could just as easily disrupt a family dinner, a company, an entire life. A smile plus a title became evidence of calculated malice. One sheet in the file included notes about Andre's biography, a Harvard MBA, an inherited family business on shaky ground turned into a sizable West Coast portfolio. There was legitimacy there, which unnerved Christopher more than Martin's sarcasm meant to soften it. Martin's research even contained a blunt line that cut through the exaggeration. Andre wasn't new to Chicago. He had been in the city for several months, operating quietly, building contacts, and, most damning, showing a recorded pattern of drawing close to powerful men to extract inside information. It was the kind of single factual point that twisted every suspicion of Christopher's into steel. He builds alliances not by stone, but by charm, and charm corrodes trust faster than rust, Christopher said gravely, though Martin rolled his eyes hard enough to ache. There were personal details in the dossier, too. Notes about Andre's history of relationships, marriages, and what Martin had scribbled in shorthand as convenient collapses. One spouse accused him of leveraging intimacy for business advantages, then leaving once opportunities dried up. Another had settled quietly after disputes involving property stakes. Martin added the notation with lowercase scrawl, pattern, blend romance with negotiations. Christopher pounded his fist against the coffee table as though no conclusion could be clearer. See? He recruits not only investors, but wives. He plunders affection through steal strategy. Martin lifted a brow, unimpressed. Or maybe he's just bad at relationships. But Christopher had stopped listening. In his mind, the file lines weren't history. They were precedent, prophecy, a map leading straight to his own doorstep. Comic details layered on top of the menace. Andre's schedule listed endless keynote addresses with grandiose titles. The future of urban energy spaces, next-gen community synergy, tomorrow's skylines today. To Martin, these were harmless bookings, functions for board executives to nod through before cocktails. But to Christopher, they were mass indoctrinations disguised as speeches. He rents ballrooms to spread false doctrine by PowerPoint, he thundered. Martin flipped to one slide capture, a city skyline pasted behind the word excellence in bold Arial font. "It's stock photos and buzzwords," Martin muttered. Christopher shook his head. Deception doesn't need complexity. It only needs repetition. These images dull crowds into obedience. And then came the clone reports, half anecdote and half complaint. Testimonies floated in Martin's notes about people leaving meetings with headaches, upholstery permanently holding Andre's scent. One rival described it as being hugged by a department store for 3 days. Martin dismissed it with a wave. Bad taste and fragrance. Christopher leaned forward, jaw stiff. It's chemical warfare. He disables rivals by atmosphere itself before his tongue deploys lies. To anyone else, none of this painted a supervillain. It suggested over-eager marketing, glossy wardrobe repetition, and aggressive personal branding. But for Christopher, each trait slotted neatly into the figure of an arch-enemy. The suit wasn't boring, it was uniform. The slogans weren't trite, they were chants for infiltration. Even Andre's posture in photographs became sinister. Sitting too relaxed in a chair meant claim, meant possession of territory that didn't belong to him. Handshakes taken slightly too firm became declarations of war disguised in etiquette. Christopher lingered longest on one image Martin had flagged almost unwillingly, a photo of Ashley outside a coffee shop, handing Andre what appeared to be nothing more than napkins or documents after a community meeting. Martin insisted the shot was meaningless, likely a question about real estate. Christopher whispered hoarsely, a ritual exchange. Tokens passed beneath daylight, exteriors masked as triviality. That's how the most enduring betrayals operate. Casual, forgettable motions. No amount of sarcasm from Martin slowed him down. Every ordinary detail thickened into a story of corruption, the empty motivational language, the polished smiles, the faint glimmer of success from a man who knew how to turn proximity and charm into leverage. For Christopher, those traits meshed with the facts Martin pointed to Andre's months in Chicago, his documented pattern of sidling close to influential households, the marital histories lined with allegation and advantage. Even the humor, the choking cologne clouds and Shutterstock slideshows served in Christopher's eyes as camouflage for predation. Martin sat back in his chair, exasperated. If you strip away your fantasy, all you've got is a guy who smells too strong and likes microphones. Christopher's response came with a measured growl. And if you strip away your cynicism, you clearly see him leading a march into my fortress. The room fell into silence after that, only the soft hum of the laptop filling the air. The dossier pages lay scattered across the coffee table. Photographs, lines of history, cheerful slogans printed in italics. For Martin, the absurdity outweighed the threat. For Christopher, it was enough. In every line, he saw insult, encroachment, theft. Andre Travis had become villain incarnate, not through sheer deed, but through Christopher's obsessive interpretation of him, which is why he knew what had to come next. Documents weren't enough. Screenshots weren't proof. A true enemy revealed himself not through files, but in person, under the gaze of those he intended to betray. Christopher's eyes narrowed, scanning the room as if seeing the plan assembled in front of him. So, he hatched a test, one that, in his mind, would expose the truth not with theory, but with presence. Martin watched his brother mutter under his breath while gathering the scattered photographs into a crooked pile. "You're not thinking," Martin began. Christopher stood, resolve plain on his face. "He joins us at the table. Face to face. No excuses." And just like that, his next move was set. He would invite Andre into his home. A dinner that would look warm and ordinary to anyone outside. For Christopher, it would be nothing less than trial by fire. So he invites Andre to dinner, on purpose, and that was the test. Homecoming with smiles. Christopher returned to his house with the careful posture of a man walking into contested ground. In reality, it was only the short walk from driveway to front step, but he composed it internally like a staged re-entry into his domain. His hands carried bags filled with airport trinkets, chocolates, t-shirts printed with bad jokes, a snow globe that barely rattled. To his mind, these weren't simple souvenirs. They were tributes, props in a ceremony of his return. He whispered, low enough for no one to hear, peace offerings accepted only from foreign soil, then braced himself at the threshold. The front door opened easily, nothing dramatic, but Christopher's head staged the moment like the curtain rise of a new act. Warm light pooled across the hall. The faint smell of dinner rose from the kitchen. His family moved toward him quickly, laughing, arms already out, their faces open and smiling. To them, it was ordinary affection. To him, each motion invited inspection, as though these gestures were rehearsed by unseen directors. Ashley reached him first. Her hug pressed warmly against his suit, a simple embrace to anyone else. But Christopher stiffened against it, convinced that contact itself carried subtext. In his inner commentary, it was the queen embracing her king, but perhaps also a test of dominance. Was her grip too firm? Did the rub of her hand against his back mean reassurance, or was it a warning disguised? He smiled back at her, strong and steady, the perfect image of a loving husband. But behind his teeth, he cataloged it in the private archive of suspicions. Brandon, taller each time Christopher saw him, offered only the kind of detached hug teenagers gave by default. Loose, brief, a bump of arms more than an embrace. Christopher's eyes narrowed for a beat too long. The air grows casual, he thought. Casualty is the edge of rebellion. Outwardly, he patted his son and asked if the week had gone smoothly. Brandon replied instantly with the only thing on his mind. Did you bring snacks? The question was normal, expected, but Christopher heard in it a coded demand for resources. He handed over chocolates with a smile, pretending this was mere fatherly affection, secretly filing the request into the growing ledger of possible disloyalties. Rachel came leaping forward with little hesitation, clinging to him with that unselfconscious eagerness younger children still carried. Her laugh rang high, the kind of simple joy that should strip all suspicion away. But Christopher, armed with Martin's warnings, remembered footage of her clutching a phone too tightly. So even this laugh, bright as it was, he analyzed. Pure delight, he admitted to himself, and let the mental note creep in anyway, or a disguise sharpened through practice, when she exclaimed, wrinkling her nose, "You smell like airplane." He forced a chuckle as father, but inside he filed the words as distraction technique, commentary designed to deflect from deeper plots. Christopher moved through his own foyer like a visitor, setting his suitcase against the stairs. Out loud, he spoke of gifts, handing out novelty items that earned laughs and thanks. For Ashley, he gave a scarf, cheaply bought yet wrapped in neat paper. She smiled, kissed him on the cheek. Brandon ripped open his chocolates greedily. Rachel turned her snow globe upside down, thrilled. In that moment, he stood convincingly as any other father returned from business, gracious, generous, playing a part expected of him. Only he knew that this, too, was calculated. The gifts weren't just tokens of affection. They were records, transactions. In his mind, he staged this normalcy as deliberate cover, a method of camouflage inside the home, while privately keeping account of loyalty in every reaction. Dinner arrived soon after. Plates of roasted chicken and vegetables circled the table, the smell of mashed potatoes filling the room. From the outside, nothing was remarkable. Christopher accepted water, pulled his chair forward, and played the role perfectly. He listened to his daughter chatter about her science class, nodded when Brandon described a dull soccer practice. He smiled back at Ashley's quick remarks across the table. But inside, every spoon, every smile, every pause was measured and subjected to his lens. He couldn't help it. In Brandon's boast of completing the school project ahead of schedule forced a tightening in Christopher's chest. Coded phrasing, he told himself, for early sabotage complete. Rachel giggled at memes on her phone, refusing to share, which to Christopher became proof of encrypted communication. Between bites of roasted chicken, he made small declarations out loud. "Strength is found in loyalty," he said once, pretending it was nothing more than an offhand maxim. His family slipped into silence before Ashley changed the subject smoothly, asking about his trip. He offered vague updates, deals secured, borders stabilized, phrased like tidings, vague enough to keep his sense of distance. Brandon rolled his eyes, so boring as usual. It stung deeper in his father's mind, recorded not as teenage sarcasm, but as provocation. Ashley tapped at her phone quietly during the meal. A grocery reminder, perhaps, or a simple text from a friend. To Christopher, amplified by suspicion, it was communication. He set his fork down and watched for the second her lips curved at the screen. She laughed lightly. His mind turned the sound sharp, foreign. Her smile mirrored itself in small creases he could not ignore. Strategic withholding, he muttered internally, naming her silence not as fatigue, but as scheme. He noticed everything. Rachel sliding leftover potatoes to the dog, currency redistribution. Brandon choosing bread over vegetables, fuel chosen in preparation. Ashley lingering in quiet, deliberate silence crafted as cover. Outwardly, he played his role: warm husband, attentive father. He pointed out crumbs at Rachel's chin, passed the salt with a smile, corrected Brandon's language when it dipped crude. He even feigned laughter when Ashley teased him about his travel souvenirs, riffing about how many snow globes now cluttered their shelves. None of them saw the narrowing of his eyes beneath those gestures, or the small ledger he kept sealed in his chest, cross-referencing dinner talk with Martin's evidence banners. But by dessert, to all appearances, their household was steady. Brandon spilled a glass of water. Ashley fetched a towel, sighing softly. Rachel complained about her homework load. The German Shepherd lay under the table, begging. For anyone else, it was simply a Thursday with family, food, and noise. For Christopher, the scene folded together like a puzzle: smiles disguising secrets, coughs signaling codes, utensils scraping porcelain as if they were weapons striking shields. His spoon against the bowl might as well have been a drawn blade. He chose to laugh with his family when appropriate. He petted the dog with casual affection. He acted convincingly, like everything was normal. But while the house hummed with comfort, he kept his chest tight, convinced every ordinary thing would later prove itself evidence. He touched each moment twice, once as the father who lived it, again as the ruler who dissected it. Every giggle and shrug stored like scraps of intelligence to revisit. There, in the familiar comfort of his own dining room, Christopher saw both the warmth of homecoming and the outline of betrayal woven into it. He smiled as he stood from the table, kissed Ashley's cheek, and carried plates to the sink like any father. She thanked him lightly, turned back to the kids, laughed softly at something Rachel said. Christopher, eyes set on the counter, calculated afresh. None of this was ordinary, even if it looked that way. And as the evening drew itself toward quiet, Christopher kept the picture steady in his mind. He was home. Yes, smiling, playing the father, playing the devoted husband. And underneath it, setting the ground for what would come next. I was home, and ready to stage the thing that would either expose them or prove my paranoia wrong. The dinner with the enemy. Andre Travis arrived at the Graham household 30 minutes late, a bottle of wine held out like it was a peace treaty. Christopher had invited him deliberately, not in the spirit of hospitality, but as a calculated test. This was no ordinary dinner guest. It was his chance to watch, to measure, and to confirm whether the suspicion gnawing at him was real. He opened the door with a rigid smile, his knuckles whitening around the handle. "Welcome," he said in a low tone that tried to hide the strain. Andre stepped in, cheerful, oblivious. Nice place. Cozy. Christopher's mind filtered even that casual remark as an intrusion. The dining room had been arranged with care, every chair a piece in his quiet experiment. Ashley, of course, sat beside Andre, the placement that Christopher insisted on under the guise of balance, but really so he could watch for contact or familiarity. Martin sat on his own side, close enough for Christopher to treat him as an ally. Brandon and Rachel opposite, teenage eyes too distracted to sense the unspoken test playing out in front of them. Even the family dog, curled restlessly under the table, became something greater in his head. Neutral bystander, capable of being swayed. Appetizers came, simple crackers, slices of cheese. Andre praised them warmly, far too warmly for Christopher's taste. He studied the tone, slow and patient, translating every word into motive. Too flattering, he told himself. Flattery to soften the walls. Ashley passed the breadbasket, and for a moment her knuckles brushed Andre's hand. He chuckled at the clumsiness. Christopher's fork came down too hard on the plate. Signals, he thought, breath unsteady. Martin had to turn away, coughing into his napkin to stifle a laugh, though he never broke the act of listening. Dinner proper, unfolded with meatloaf and mashed potatoes steaming at the center. Christopher cut into his with deliberate precision, watching across the table. Seconds stretched. Then he spoke. "Tell me, Mr. Travis, how do you define loyalty?" He asked the question as if it were a trial, yet he balanced his words with a spoonful of potatoes. Andre startled slightly, then gave a half-shrug mid-bite. "By showing up when it matters, I guess." The answer snapped tight in Christopher's mind. He set his knife down harder than necessary. Showing up, he repeated. A creed easy to say, harder to keep. Arriving in the wrong place can betray more than absence ever could. At once, conversation stilled. Ashley sighed as if bored with another heavy performance. Martin swallowed quickly from his glass, hiding a grin. Andre hesitated, but then simply nodded, muttering, "Fair point," before returning to his meal. Christopher wasn't satisfied. He sprinkled the conversation with small project details, eyeing Andre's body language more than listening to his words. "We've been reviewing a property near the lake," he said casually, laying the line like bait. "A development that will reshape the downtown core if moved forward." It was vague enough not to matter, but he studied every twitch of Andre's posture. Andre raised his eyebrows, slight, involuntary, and Christopher caught it, savoring it like proof. "He reacts," he recorded silently. "Information hooks the infiltrator." Ashley, stacking a serving of vegetables, paid the comment no attention, but to Christopher this only deepened the secrecy. Tension saturated small gestures. Rachel's foot kicked her brother under the table and Brandon yelped, spilling a piece of potato. The dog darted forward to catch it, bumping against Andre's leg. Andre laughed. "Friendly dog." Christopher narrowed his eyes. "Acknowledged by the beast himself," he whispered with suspicion. The remark earned Martin another coughing fit, which he hid by claiming the wrong sip of water. The dinner table carried both order and collapse at once. Andre's stories ran long, about networking events and promotional pins. Christopher heard none of it as ordinary small talk. Pins became contracts, signed allegiance. Events became gatherings of conspirators. Each careless laugh across the table hardened Christopher's belief. With every casual reference, a story stitched itself darker inside his imagination. The second passing of potatoes gave him another opportunity. Ashley leaned across Andre again, brushing him with her sleeve. To the children, it was nothing. To Christopher, it was a coronation gesture replayed under his roof. He pressed his fork harshly against his plate. "Trust is fragile," he declared in a sharp voice that cut through the clink of cutlery. The children glanced up briefly, shrugged, and returned to their plates. Ashley muttered, "Not now," under her breath. Andre blinked in confusion. Martin nearly choked, holding his laugh in. Christopher leaned forward anyway, unwilling to drop his grip on the stage he created. "Every table," he said, voice lowered now, "divides the loyal from the false. You must watch the hand that offers you bread and the one that takes it." His eyes flicked from Ashley to Andre to Martin, seeking resonance. Only silence and small motions answered him. Brandon yawned. Rachel checked her phone. Andre smiled faintly and asked for the butter. Christopher studied the offhand request as though it carried code. To the rest of the family, this was just another dinner with his theatrics stretched a beat too long. For Christopher, the evening had been war disguised in napkins and cutlery. He tallied observations beneath the surface of conversation. Ashley's smiles, Andre's pauses, his children's disinterest. Each trivial note became intelligence. Each unremarkable gesture became ammunition for the ledger he was building silently in his head. He let dessert close the evening in ordinary fashion, pie cut in quiet slices. Andre thanked Ashley warmly, complimented the seasoning again, mentioned buying napkins at a nearby store. Brandon asked to leave the table early. Rachel fed a crust to the dog. All of it ordinary. All of it suspicious to Christopher, who cataloged every move with the same tension he carried from the moment the door opened. But amid the background laughter and softened talk, Christopher locked onto one thing. Andre had reacted when the lake property slipped into the discussion. The pause, the raised brow, the brief stillness, that was enough for him. He read it as confirmation. The bait had touched. When the dishes cleared and Andre left with his coat, Christopher remained rigid at the table, replaying each sign. The enemy had sat across from him, hidden in plain sight. For his family, the evening ended in yawns and cleanup. For Christopher, it had just opened the door to strategy. Upstairs, the house finally quiet, he already framed the next step. If Andre wanted information, Christopher would feed him. but only carefully chosen words planted to set the trap. The dinner had given him the proof he needed. Now came the part where he designed a plan that matched his own stage. Christopher's master plan. Christopher hunched over his desk as though preparing for war, the light from his desk lamp pulling across a battlefield, not of maps, but sticky notes. Every surface was covered. Pink notes, scrawled with countermeasures. Yellow ones marked psyops. Green squares labeled economic warfare. And to outsiders, it looked like somebody had detonated an office supply store. To Christopher, it was the master plan, campaign of precision. A design meant to restore order within a household he believed had already crossed in rebellion. He whispered to himself in the near dark. Phase 1 begins. This time there was structure. Not just scattered post-its, but what he proudly called the 4 phases. He leaned across the desk, stabbing each finger into the air as he recited them to Martin, who sat across with the look of a man trapped in an eccentric lecture. Phase 1, intelligence gathering. Phase 2, establish control while appearing indifferent. Phase 3, confront with the evidence. And Phase 4, consequence. He let the last word hang long in the room. This is how empires endure. Martin squinted at the wall of color-coded scraps. You sound like a general. You look like a teacher who lost control of the craft cabinet. But Christopher pressed on with confidence. Under Phase 1 were scraps dictating moves like review enemy routines and interrogate behaviors. In practice, this began with him riffling through drawers in his own office to retrieve a missing stapler, then jotting down observations as though he had unearthed contraband. He logged Ashley's grocery runs like coded deliveries, counted Rachel's viewings of pop songs as timed broadcasts, and beyond the prankish scrap notes, he sketched in something real. Andre Travis. Intelligence gathering, Christopher decided, would include deliberately feeding Andre access to minor documents, not true financial records, but partial drafts and irrelevant files uploaded into shared folders, just to watch what he did with them. Plant false material, he whispered gravely, and track the leak. Phase 2 unfolded on another section of sticky notes, maintain outward calm. No sudden accusations. Let them trust in their triumph. It was a stage play, he explained, in which he would act as if nothing disturbed him, smiling through dinners, brushing off delays, pretending to miss every signal. They must never suspect I see everything. I sit with them in daylight as one of their own, but my eyes are fixed on every flinch, every glance. Martin rubbed his forehead. You're seriously calling forgotten remote signal intelligence? Christopher didn't flinch. He pivoted the laptop towards his brother with a flourish, revealing a PowerPoint titled Strategic Fortifications, Revenge Protocol 2.0. Each slide whooshed into view with sound effects he had proudly purchased. Phrases in block letters filled the screen, enemies within the gates. Punitive rations. Total control. Stock clip art images glowed. Chains breaking, cartoon knights with gleaming swords, flames across titles as if heralding epic campaigns. But the substance of his control tactics melted into petty domestic interference. A sticky note labeled Cyberstrike listed only one move: unplugging the Wi-Fi router, placing it in his car, and driving away. Another, labeled Food Blockade, involved swapping Ashley's preferred coffee with decaf. He muttered to Martin, "This is not spite. This is rehearsal for the reveal." Brandon's strategy page had instructions to hide all Xbox controllers, every last one, so his alliances would collapse. Rachel's section contained a password lock for the television, Kingdom 123. Christopher sighed with satisfaction. She will fail to watch her nightly concerts. Her loyalty will fray within the hour. Martin stared long at the notes and asked flatly, "You know everyone in this house has phone data, right? Wi-Fi goes down, they still stream." Christopher only raised his hand. "They think in hours. I think in eras. A plan's power is not its force, but its timing." He materialized another face of the PowerPoint with relish. Clips of marching armies paired with bullet points about undermining morale. "This," Christopher explained, "is psychological warfare. I deny coffee, they feel shaken. I misplace sugar, doubt creeps in. I ration snacks, they descend into frustration. Their petty comforts vanish, and the enemy collapses under the weight of uncertainty. Martin tilted back, grimacing at the slide of a cartoon lightning bolt beside the words decaf strike. Yet, alongside the post-it pranks, one file stood out on the desk, a printed page titled Operation Mirror Drop. Martin squinted at the detail. Unlike the others, this wasn't about hiding cereal boxes. It described quietly passing low-value documents toward Andre while copying every email chain, recording timestamps, and saving receipts of their exchange. Here was a tactic with teeth. Bait him with trash, Christopher said, voice firm, then capture proof of theft. They will eat the hollow fruit, and I will trace the trail. His eyes gleamed. This is performance, but with real teeth. Martin leaned back with a low whistle. Congratulations, you finally mixed an actual strategy into this circus. Christopher ignored the tone. He only nodded. Both are necessary. The spectacle masks the precision. The family thinks the Wi-Fi failure might be my peak aggression. Andre thinks he is winning my trust with scattered intel. And in that moment, they reveal themselves. He tapped the sequence of sticky notes, his rhythm sharp against the desk. First the nuisance, then the net. Several more notes outlined backup measures. Adjusting household clocks 7 minutes forward to breed disarray. Swapping brand-name cereal for off-brand imitations to erode confidence in supply lines. Misplacing the dog's leash so morning routines fractured. Martin scribbled in his own notebook, stage coup with store-brand cornflakes. Christopher paced the floor, unaware or uninterested in the mockery. To him, each inconvenience layered stress, each minor deprivation shaping enemy uncertainty. By late night, his voice thickened with certainty. Understand, Martin, power doesn't arrive all at once. It drips, builds, and then strikes. The family laughs, continues their lives. Andre accepts his access, thinking me naive. They believe time is theirs. But I already hold time. All that remains is phase 3. Martin muttered. Which is what again? Christopher spun sharply, eyes lit. The reveal. Evidence unveiled with no escape. It will be shown directly, unambiguously, that betrayal is not assumption but fact. Lies will collapse once the record speaks. His hand lingered on the keyboard with something between pride and trepidation. I will not raise my voice. I will not strike. Punishment arrives clean. Authority restored. Silence fell between them, the only sound, the hum of the lamp. For Martin, the wall of sticky notes still looked absurd, pranks painted in military language. For Christopher, it was a complete architecture, humor as camouflage, pettiness as training ground, deception built to reveal itself at the chosen hour. He slumped into his chair, satisfied. It will not be tonight. Patience is part of design, but soon. His voice dropped further. The next step is staged not on scraps of paper, but in the presence of those who doubt me. They will sit before me. The air will shift. And then the gates will close, and I will hold every card. And with that certainty, Christopher sat in the darkened study, already scripting his next move, the setting, the audience, and the moment he would allow the act of revelation to unfold. The reveal party. Christopher chose evening for the unveiling, convinced the hour itself would amplify the gravity of what was to come. He darkened the living room, tugged the curtain shut, and arranged the family together on the couch. Ashley crossed her arms and leaned back. Brandon slouched with his phone glowing in one hand, and Rachel tucked her sleeves over her fingers, face expectant but blank. They assumed a lecture waited for them, something about homework or curfews. Instead, Christopher stood in the middle of the carpet beside a discount Bluetooth speaker, chin lifted, eyes glinting with certainty. He gestured solemnly to this small device. Tonight, he declared, truth is amplified. He pressed play. Instead of accusations, instead of betrayal, the room heard his own voice echoing through the tiny speaker. You are the Empire, Christopher. The words boomed in distorted treble as though they came from the bottom of a tin can. His family blinked. Brandon immediately stifled laughter, shaking his head while reaching for his phone to record the moment. Rachel leaned forward, half smirking, half shocked. Ashley did not move. Christopher scrambled, stabbing at the buttons. The speaker barked at him again. The throne does not wobble. The throne does not wobble. Rachel's mouth dropped open. Did you record pep talks for yourself? She asked, her tone teetering between disbelief and laughter. Christopher's ears fired red. Not that file, he muttered, scrolling frantically with sweaty hands. The room waited. Finally, he found what he needed and jabbed the button one last time. This time the television flickered as Martin brought up feed from the laptop. The grainy footage filled the screen. Ashley in the office, Andre slipping casually into Christopher's chair. Christopher raised his hand like a prosecutor. Behold, the breach. The fortress undone by collusion. He expected outrage, gasps, admissions. Instead, Ashley tilted her head, watching herself shuffle things on the desk. That's me cleaning your mess. You left cups of yogurt molding in the drawer, she said flatly. Christopher began pacing with his hands clasped behind his back, narrating aloud as though Ashley's sighs on camera were confessions. That was not cleaning. That was concealment. A sigh of deceit. Ashley sighed again, louder. Then Andre appeared clearly, seated in the office chair, arms spread casually across the sides. Christopher's voice sharpened. There, the enemy enthroned. Rachel frowned. Dad, he's just sitting down. He looks bored. Brandon glanced up from his phone. Yeah, he's literally just a guy in a chair. Christopher stopped. That chair represents sovereignty. To occupy it without oath is violation itself. Ashley covered her face with her hand, pressing her palm against her forehead as if willing the words away. The reel rolled on. Brandon appeared on screen, renaming documents. Christopher's fingers stabbed the air. Behold, the air's treachery. Puzzles passed off as essays. Brandon exhaled, too tired for drama. I borrowed your laptop for school. I renamed your Sudoku file to look like homework. You seriously spend office time making puzzles? His face stretched into a smirk, and Rachel collapsed into giggles, sliding against the couch. Christopher kept narrating over them. Mockery itself becomes rebellion. Martin, holding the remote by the TV, leaned against the wall, arms folded, failing to hide his grin. To Christopher, this was solemn evidence. To his family, it was comedy. Ashley leaned forward in disbelief. Let me understand this. You had Martin set up cameras in our home just so you could show us throwing out garbage and renaming files? This is your grand reveal? Christopher raised two hands, voice sharp. Not garbage. Conspiracy. Not renaming. Subversion. Every act aligned with Andre. And then came disaster. From the Bluetooth speaker, unbidden, another pep talk file autoplayed. Christopher's own warped voice bellowed, "Without loyalty, you are but dust, Christopher." The words cracked and echoed in the silence. Brandon dropped his phone mid-laugh. Rachel buried her face in her hoodie, laughing until she couldn't breathe. Christopher winced, pressing buttons. The pep-track voice repeated again, "Stay strong, Christopher. Even furniture respects you." His thumb finally silenced it. He stood, jacket clinging damply to his back, face burning at the sound his own voice had made in the dark. He whispered under his breath, "No matter. The recordings already prove it." This whispered note was meant for himself, but Martin caught it. He tilted his head, smirk tugging at his face. Christopher held his chin high again, determined not to yield. The tension he expected had shattered. Instead of solemn confessions, the room was a chorus of laughter and exasperation. Rachel yelled between giggles, "Long live Sudoku." Brandon held his chest and keeled sideways on the couch, gasping, "The throne does not wobble." Ashley shook her head slowly, muttering, "This is pathetic," before standing and stepping toward the kitchen. Christopher stomped one foot. No, this is victory. They proved their complicity not through silence, but through mockery. Laughter itself unmasks guilt. From the kitchen, Ashley's voice came sharp. "It's laughter at you." He waved it away, voice low and certain. Defensiveness is also admission. Martin exhaled a laugh so thick he had to set the remote down. He shook his head and murmured, "You realize you look like a bad reality show right now, right?" Christopher ignored him. He lifted his hand dramatically over the gathering, announcing, "The court is adjourned. The Empire stands." Brandon, still filming, stretched across the couch in mock agony. "The Empire," he called, tumbling back like a stabbed soldier in a play. Rachel clapped theatrically and shouted again, "Sudoku forever." Their laughter rolled over him, boundless, careless. Ashley returned briefly, towel in one hand, eyes heavy with disbelief. She studied him as if standing across from not a husband but a man who'd built an entire stage where dinner used to be. And yet, Christopher dug in, spine straight. He stared at the screen one more time, the images of Ashley with Andre, his children fumbling near him. In his own narration, the judgment remained clear. Evidence existed. Betrayal was undeniable. Their laughter did not erase the record. Behind his humiliation lingered certainty. Consequences would follow. He muttered quietly, Phase 4 awaits. For him, this was triumph still, not in the eyes rolling, not in the snickering around the couch, but in the surveillance captured, in the archive stored, and in his insistence that kingship, held by force of will, remained strong. His family sighs replaced the laughter at last. Brandon wiped his eyes. Rachel reached for her phone again. Ashley leaned against the doorway, watching none of it with interest. Yet Christopher kept the posture of a ruler who had confirmed treachery under his roof and would act accordingly. The living room lights hummed, the television glow faded, and the Bluetooth device clicked itself silent. What had been staged as a moment of collapse, Christopher reframed in his mind as foundation for the steps to come. And so the house returned to its rhythm, the family restless with laughter and annoyance. Christopher resolved, waiting for the next motion in what he alone still treated as a battle. In the end, Christopher's conviction carried weight far beyond theatrics. His surveillance and staged reveal led to real consequences. Ashley faced investigations tied to Andre. The children were sent away, and Christopher remained behind, ruler of a home that now felt emptied but fiercely his. What to outsiders looked like overreaction and parody had hardened into permanence. He saw everyday slips as battle lines, dinner talk as coded rebellion, spilled food as sabotage. And when the dust settled, he believed he had one. So what do you think? Who played it worst, Ashley, the kids, or Andre? Or was it really just the lasagna?